right. So this will be the first of two slideshow sections that you will use and take notes on this week. We're going to be talking about Reconstruction this week and really focus in on how it impacted Arkansas and the state that it left our state in. So we have to ask, what is Reconstruction? Reconstruction is commonly known as the period of history immediately following the Civil War. It gets its name because it was considered a time for the United States to come back together or to reconstruct. Specifically, talking about the formerly seceded southern states coming back into the fold of the Union. And the view of Reconstruction has evolved over many years. For many years, it was seen as a failure in the South both by the North and in the South. Southerners did not think that they were given their full rights back. They felt like the federal government overstepped their legal rights. And in the North, many pointed to the disenfranchisement of Black Americans and the civil rights that they experienced for a brief amount of time, but then lost soon after. At the time of Reconstruction, the Republicans did not simply want the South to re-enter the Union. We're talking near the end of the Civil War here. You have the war is coming to a close. The North is rapidly gaining more southern territory, and it's very evident that the South is going to lose the war. And so President Lincoln and his cabinet begin discussing what the proper course of action will be for readmitting the southern states. And it's during this time that you see two types of Republicans emerge within the party. You have the moderate Republicans and the radical Republicans. Lincoln will be classified as a moderate Republican, and we'll talk about a little bit more about what those differences are in a few slides. During this conversation of how to readmit the Union, Lincoln comes up with what is termed as his 10% plan, and this plan is going to be based on presidential pardons. But we have to explain what a pardon is. So a pardon, if you look at the picture on the left, is a government decision to allow a person who has been committed or convicted of a crime to be free and absolved of that conviction as if never convicted. What this means is if somebody committed a crime, in this case treason against the United States by seceding, President Lincoln could pardon that person and their crimes to be forgiven, almost like they have never committed that crime. Pardons are still used today, and some presidents pardon more people than others, but the idea is if somebody's been wrongly convicted, or if there are special circumstances surrounding the crime, or if enough time has passed, then sometimes presidents will pardon people based on the circumstances surrounding their situation. So Lincoln is going to use presidential pardons to readmit southern states. The main pieces of his plan stated that Southerners who took an oath of allegiance would immediately receive a presidential pardon. So people who took an oath stating that they no longer supported the Confederacy, that they apologized for their actions, they would immediately receive a pardon from President Lincoln. Now, there were some people that were excluded from this, notably high officials in the Confederacy. So think men like Jefferson Davis and other congressmen and federal officials of the Confederacy. Many of these people, generals, were excluded from this plan. Southern states had to have 10% of their 1860 electorate, and then they could re-enter the Union. So if you look at the plan, it's very much 10% of the electorate. That is a very small portion of the population, because you have to remember, only men, white men, voted in the 1860 election. And so this is a very, very, very small section of a state's population. And yet Lincoln says once they have 10%, we will readmit them into the Union. It's honestly a very lenient plan. The other provisions of Lincoln's 10% plan was that they also had to adopt a new constitution, that is a state constitution, abolish slavery, and then pay off the debts that they gathered during the war. And again, we say that it's very lenient to the South. You see, Arkansas only needed 5,400 oaths to be reinstated to the Union. Looking at a state whose population was about 300,000 at that time, and of that, only about 200,000 were not slaves during 1860. That is a very, very small percentage of the electorate. And so, on January of 1864, 24 pro-Union delegates met in Little Rock. And in 1864, we get our state's third state constitution. They voted on March of 1864. There was 12,000 voters. So you notice of the electorate, you see there's 12,000 voters in this state election. And Isaac Murphy will be elected the first governor of Arkansas after the Civil War. Again, just a reminder, Isaac Murphy is the lone dissenting vote when Arkansas held its secession convention and voted to secede. Murphy did not vote in favor of secession. And so obviously he has been rewarded for that. It would be considered somebody that did not even need to take that oath of allegiance because they had never supported the South. After the election of our Arkansan officials, you see a common problem in the earliest years of Reconstruction. So Congress, that is the federal Congress in Washington, D.C., refused to seat newly elected Southern congressmen, not just from Arkansas, but from many of the other Southern states that had not yet been readmitted, putting that in air quotes, readmitted into the Union. Because many Northern congressmen who were Republicans were very staunchly against simply readmitting the Southern states. And so, in order to combat Lincoln's proposed 10% plan, they will enact the Wade-Davis bill. It'll be much stricter than Lincoln's 10% plan. So, unlike Lincoln's plan, the Wade-Davis bill called for martial law in the Southern states, a majority of the 1860 election rather than just 10%, meaning that over half of the electors in 1860 had to take the oath of allegiance rather than 10. And then delegates to the Constitutional Convention, that is the men that were sent to establish the new state constitutions, had to take what was known as the ironclad oath, stating that they had never supported the Confederacy. This was a very difficult thing to do because you did have states like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina that were very staunchly against being readmitted into the Union. They were very much in favor of seceding and being a part of the Confederacy. And so they would be hard pressed to find enough qualified individuals that could take this ironclad oath without fear of compromising their own honor or their integrity. So you can see that the Davis bill is very much more strict than Lincoln's 10% plan. We'll see how Lincoln reacts to that. The last point of the Wade-Davis bill is that state constitutions had to repudiate slavery and debt. Repudiate meaning completely disagree with, not think of as legitimate. This was the last point of the Wade-Davis bill. It also barred high Confederates from voting. And when we say high Confederates, we mean people that were very high up in the Confederate federal government. So men that had served in high positions like president, vice president, and other officials within the Confederate federal government. Lincoln does not approve of the Wade-Davis bill, and so he will pocket veto the bill. A pocket veto simply means he does not sign his veto to the bill, but rather he says he will let the bill or the session of Congress end or expire, and so the bill also expires. It has to be passed before the session of Congress ends. The session ended without Lincoln signing the bill, and so in effect it was vetoed. It's also during this time you see the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau was an early effort to provide some form of assistance to former slaves in the United States. Is humanitarian aid primarily for freed slaves, hence the name Freedmen's Bureau. And the Bureau will be active for a number of years, even in the 20th century, designed to provide assistance, that is jobs, education, food, other humanitarian aid to former slaves. It's at this point, the assassination of President Lincoln, that we really have to stop and look at kind of where Reconstruction changes. And if we were going to circle kind of a date where Reconstruction shifts, it would be at the assassination of President Lincoln. He is shot on April 14th, 1865, in Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth, an actor who was a supporter of the Confederacy. Lincoln's assassination shook the nation. This was the first time a sitting president had been killed while in office. It was not the first time a president had died, but it was the first time a president had been killed. And in the North, especially with the radical Republicans, you see an increased desire to punish the South. And the problem was that the assassination of Lincoln took one of the best politicians ever of all time from the White House. And even more importantly to the South, Lincoln was one of the best friends to the South. He staunchly defended a more lenient reincorporation of the Southern states. He was not in favor of overly punishing them or continuing to kind of keep the Union separated. He knew that uniting the country quickly would help the country mend sooner. But it is his assassination that keeps him from carrying out that agenda. Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, will take over after the death of Lincoln, and it will essentially get a full term because Lincoln won the election of 1864, dies very early on in 1865. And so Johnson essentially gets the full 4 years. Johnson's an interesting character, and many people have cast blame on him for essentially failing the Union during the time of Reconstruction. Johnson was a former Southern Democrat, so he was from the South. He ran with Lincoln to try to unite the nation, which was a more common idea back then. You would never see, say, a Republican presidential candidate run with a Democratic vice presidential candidate today, but it was quite common back then. But he was a former Southern Democrat turned Unionist. So when the South is especially pushing for secession, he stays loyal and serves the Union instead. But he is not trusted by either party because he has Southern ties, but he is trying to carry out the agenda of Lincoln. And so he will try to continue Lincoln's plan, Lincoln's vision of Reconstruction, but without that support, he's going to struggle to do so. Once again, in 1865, Governor Murphy tries to hold elections again. Arkansas selects a few delegates to send to Congress, and yet they are refused once again. A year after the war, which is the year we're in, you see Confederate veterans begin to return to Arkansas and will label themselves conservatives. The reason behind this is because the term Democrat had put a bad taste in many people's mouths because it was primarily Democrats that had pushed for secession in the South. And so after the Civil War, Republicans had come into the South, completely taken over all of the governments, and Democrats did not have kind of standing to run on. And so these former Democrats will label themselves for a time as conservatives. And you see the change in name as well as who the men were works quite well for the conservatives. In the election of 1866, conservatives swept unionists out of every office except for governor and secretary of state. So Governor Murphy will continue his term. But you can see how the sentiments that were in Arkansas prior to the war were very much still alive. This was not something that just went away once Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Many of the feelings present prior to the war still existed in the state. Our two senators elected in 1866 were actually two ex-Confederates, men that had served in the war, were Confederate officials, and they will legitimize the war debts, meaning that they say that the debts they accumulated were proper and that they should get ample time to pay them off. And many other southern states will do this. They will not say that they were unjust debt accumulated, but rather they were debts that that were a normal thing for states to do, which obviously they were not, considering that they had tried to leave the country. But many southern states will legitimize their war debts. Mississippi will go a step further and refuse to ratify the 13th Amendment, which ended slavery. So you can see that there is a strong resistance to, amongst the southern states, to many of the changes the federal government is trying to implement during this time. By 1866, African Americans could get married and have property. They could not, however, vote, hold office, serve on juries, or marry white people. So there was no interracial marriages. Many African Americans were prevented from voting or could not vote, and few, if any, could hold office or serve on juries, which doesn't seem like the serving on juries may not seem like a major issue, but if somebody is going to trial and their jury is supposed to be of one's peers, well, if it is a black person on trial and the entire jury is white, then it is not a jury of one's peers. It has to be a mixture there, and there was not at this time. You see many states pass what were known as the Black Codes, which placed early restrictions on blacks in the southern United States, but not only in the southern United States. These were passed in the north as well. Johnson, being the former Southern Democrat, declares Reconstruction at this point, 1866, a success, showing his narrow-mindedness. He has no idea how much longer Reconstruction will go, and we are a long way from calling Reconstruction completed. At this time, 1866, moderate and radical Republicans wanted more rights for African Americans, and they will begin working to gather those rights or acquire those rights for African Americans, notably the ones in the South. Arkansas's delegates were denied again in 1866. And this seems odd, but at this time, many northern states and even the federal government did not consider the southern states readmitted to the Union, which is interesting considering Lincoln never contended that the states had actually left the Union, but there was still a process they had to go through to be a part of the Union or officially a part of the Union once again. And so this continued rejection of delegates shows that the North is not going to let the South just come back in and resume business as usual. It's also during this time that Arkansas farmers returned to growing cotton. During 1866 and 1867, there was quite poor production. And then during this time, the cotton market will drop significantly, and there will be basically a bust in the cotton market. Prices drop significantly. It does not make as much money. And Arkansas, for a time, will move away from cotton. Many southern states will continue to press on growing the crop, but it is very difficult to grow certain crops in the South after the Civil War because of the way that the landscape was altered. After the Civil War, you see a major issue emerge across really the southern United States as you have millions of former slaves now freed. Many of them were without food, shelter, your basic requirements. And so, in response to this, although many slaves did not have the resources to purchase their own land or be hired as a full time employee, a new system will emerge across the South, and that system is known as sharecropping. What sharecropping consisted of, a farmer, typically a former slave, would rent land, oftentimes from their former masters. They would grow their crops on the land, harvest it, and then sell the crop. And the way the system worked is not only did they pay rent to the owner of the land, but they would also give a portion of the profit from the crops to the owner. This created the responsibilities that the farmers had created almost an inescapable debt for many black farmers, and sharecropping will quickly become recognized as kind of a new form of slavery, except this time it was accepted because the farmers would earn a wage, but many times the debt they owed to the owner of the land was so vast that they could not grow enough crops to pay off that debt. And the system was designed that way. It was designed to keep the farmers working the land for the owners so that the owners did not have to farm the land themselves. It should be noted that sharecropping was not only done by former slaves, but many poor whites also participated in sharecropping too. Now that there was no longer slavery, poor whites who prior to the Civil War could not have done a system like this now partook in sharecropping as well. In 1866, Congress passes the first Civil Rights Act in our nation's history. The act was designed to counteract every measure of the black codes. It granted full citizenship to all blacks. It gave them the right to own property and gave them protections in the court systems. Not only would they have be allowed to serve on juries, but they would also have protections within the courts. Johnson, as a Southern Democrat or a former Southern Democrat, vetoes the bill, but is overridden by a two-thirds majority of Congress, and so the Civil Rights Act of 1866 will pass. The 14th Amendment was used as the precedent and justification to give Congress the right to pass the Civil Rights Act. The 14th Amendment is the amendment stating that the rights of citizens cannot be infringed upon by any government. And so, as a part of the Constitution now, the Civil Rights Act gives Congress this right, but also allows them to pass legislation to protect the rights of the citizens. The 14th Amendment will also be used to punish the South. And the punishments written into the 14th Amendment really only apply to the former slave states and the former Confederate states. It reduced representation based on the number of African American voters. The reason for this is because in southern states, even after the passage of the 14th and even the 15th Amendment, southern states will find ways to continue to keep blacks from voting. And so the 14th Amendment, this punishment written into the 14th Amendment, reduced representation based on the number of African American voters, which harmed the South's voting body. And again, you can see it only punished slave states because 5 different northern states disenfranchised African Americans, and yet this did not it did not apply to the northern states because they had not seceded from the Union. So it's important to see that this was taking place really across the country, and yet after the Civil War, it was still only the South that was scrutinized by the federal government. It also banned any former Confederate federal officials unless they were pardoned by Congress. So these former Confederate officials could not only They could not serve in Congress, but they could also not vote unless they were pardoned by Congress. So you can see how they are trying to keep Confederate influence out of our nation's politics during this time. Because of Johnson's continued estrangement with not only the Republicans but also the remaining Democrats in the country, many in Congress will begin to seek ways to get him out of office, and that will result in the impeachment of Johnson in 1867. This is the first time a president is ever impeached, and he is impeached after Congress passes a law that was designed to trap him. The law stated that the president could not fire any of his cabinet officials. And this was done after Johnson had many disagreements with many of his cabinet members because they were actually members of Lincoln's cabinet, but he had kept them once he took over the presidency. After they passed the law, he defiantly fires one of his cabinet members. The House passes articles of impeachment against him, but the Senate vote failed to convict him by one vote. So Johnson will remain in office, though very much out of power. Congress is definitely in control at this point. In March of the same year, you see the first Reconstruction Act, which is important to point out because, as we said earlier, Johnson in 1866 declared that Reconstruction was a success, and now in March of 1867, we are getting our first Reconstruction Act. And it is much more in line with the radical Republicans' stance on Reconstruction rather than President Lincoln's stance on Reconstruction. It provided for martial law in the southern states outside of the Union. And the South will be split into 5 military districts. Arkansas will be under the control of a guy named General Ord, who's the scary-looking demon guy to the left. And constitutional conventions had to be approved by Congress. They had to allow for black enfranchisement or giving them the right to vote, as well as Confederate disenfranchisement. So those that had not taken the oath of loyalty or the ironclad oath or been pardoned by Congress, none of these men could vote. But the constitutional conventions had to provide for the black vote. And the last point of the first Reconstruction Act is that the 14th Amendment had to be ratified by the southern states before they could be readmitted into the Union. And so this is interesting because they're basically twisting the southern states' arms to get them back into the Union. And again, if we compare it to Lincoln's 10% plan, it is much more strict. It essentially provides for the occupation of the South until the states are readmitted. When Arkansas has its constitutional convention, 2/3 of the delegates were radical Republicans or associated with the radical Republicans, and 8 of the delegates were black. So you do see that representation taking place. And then in 1868, we are given our 4th state constitution. It allowed for the full citizenship of blacks, limited the power of the governor, very similar to Arkansas's previous state constitutions, but the full citizenship for blacks was the main change. And that'll give us our next forever date of June 22nd, 1868. Arkansas will rejoin the Union. So they leave the Union in 1861 and will rejoin the Union in 1868. So that's your next forever date. 1868, Arkansas rejoins the Union. 6 other states joined. According to the Constitution, 3/4 of states have to ratify an amendment for it to become a part of the Constitution. So 6 other states will join along with Arkansas. Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia refuse to join. And because of that, Congress puts additional requirements on them before they can be readmitted. They were now required to ratify the 15th Amendment to reenter, and the 15th Amendment states that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. This amendment was designed to ensure that black voting rights would not be taken away, but the problem is many times southern states in particular found ways to work around this. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into Jim Crow. By 1870, all Southern states are now back in the Union. So 6 years after the Civil War, all the Southern states have rejoined. But as we said, Southern states will continue to disenfranchise blacks. So that is our first section of notes for this week. There will be another section later this week. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Your open note quiz, yes, it's open note, so use your notes and this slideshow as you take the quiz. That quiz will be due tomorrow at 11:59 p.m. So you have basically until tomorrow night to complete it. Should not take you that long, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Hope you're all doing well. Hope you're all safe. And once again, if you just have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.